So once you see the English Empire deciding to invest fully in African slave labor, what you see materializing here is something called the triangular trade system. And let's recall our discussion of mercantilism earlier. We noted that there was trade established with the colonies in North America, let's say with England, whereby you see finished goods being sent to the markets in North America or perhaps in the Caribbean, places like Jamaica or Bermuda, English colonies of the Caribbean. And in return, you see unfinished goods mostly being sent across the way to back to England, such as whale oil, lumber, furs, rice, tobacco, sugar, if it's coming from the Caribbean area. So what's going to happen is once you see them fully investing in African slavery, the trade system that is, it's going to add a leg here going down to Africa. And obviously they're going to trade with African slave traders for that human cargo of slaves that are going to be sent here on the second leg of this triangular trade system. And that second leg is known as the Middle Passage. Okay, so the first route here, we see places like Bristol, right, that are still around today. By the way, these cities like Bristol and so forth, they're actually going to emerge due to the slave trade, right? So much wealth and profit was gained as a result of using African slave labor that it'll give rise to these port cities like Bristol, and it'll give rise to the emergence of the modern finance system in England, for example. And some historians note this: it'll actually subsidize, that is to say, the gains or wealth made from African slavery. It's going to subsidize the Industrial Revolution itself, which happens in the late 1700s in England. So it's important to note that how heavily invested they are and the amount of wealth that they're gaining as a result of African slavery. All right, so the first leg involves trade in particular commodities deemed desirable by African slave traders. And we noted that in the beginning, right, that there were African slave traders themselves selling other Africans to the English, in this case, uh, in this triangular trade system. Now, this is largely because of the profit made by these African traders. They noticed that they would fetch as much as 20 or 30 times more than they would, let's say, in selling these slaves in parts of Africa. So, of course, that's strong. That was a strong inducement in deciding to trade with the English. So, what they traded for was guns and textiles, iron, beer, and particularly guns is going to wreak havoc when it comes to the intertribal warfare on the western coast of Africa. Okay, by the way, the area we're talking about is around here, areas that were well known as trade ports for slavery, like the Bight of Benin, Benin, uh, present day places like Sierra Leone. Okay, these were slave ports. And yeah, when they trade for guns, some historians have noted that once it became incorporated in the conflict here, you see a demographic crisis occur. In fact, let me just say that some historians note that, or postulate that the beginning of the slave trade with Europeans marks the beginning of underdevelopment of the African continent as a whole. Okay, that's how traumatic it was in the long run. Okay, because we still talk about Africa as being, or most places of Africa as being underdeveloped, right, or still developing when they're so rich in natural resources. Well, some historians note that this is really the beginning of it once you become involved in heavy trade with Europeans. Okay, so typically what needed to happen for these African slave traders is they had to go hinterland to the hinterland areas, and they captured them, right? So what's noticeable here is when it comes to African ethnic groups and linguistic groups that are going to be sent through the Middle Passage to the New World, you'll see that particular ones were, represented um, highly, demographically speaking. Um, Linguistic groups or tribal groups such as the Shanta and the Igbo tribe, right, and so forth, the Fanta. Okay, and there was no affinity linguistically speaking between these groups, right? In fact, surviving slaves would tell stories once they became settled as slaves in North America that in recalling their journey to the New World, they would try to establish communication with other slaves to see who was there and who could communicate with them, and maybe even try to be involved in some kind of, you know, revolt against the slave traders. Okay, so we shouldn't get the picture, in other words, that it was just this homogeneous group of Africans. Actually, it was quite diverse when it comes to different ethnic groups, but they were located in this part of Africa. You didn't see ethnic groups, for example, found in, say, Ethiopia or more the mid area of Africa, right? So these slaves would be sent across what's called, again, the Middle Passage. And needless to say, the Middle Passage was a harrowing ordeal. At first, it took quite a few months, let's say 3 months. And then they found ways to, the easiest routes, right? They got it down to a science, so to say, whereby it only took about a month. But still, what you had happening is slaves being crammed aboard these slave ships. Now, I know this is a little hard to see here, but this is a sort of architectural rendering of or design of a slave ship. And if you took a closer look, you would notice that these little things across here are actually human bodies. Okay, so they're human bodies lying down on their backs. So, according to this architectural rendering, they're planning in specific detail how many they could fit in a slave ship. Now, there's different ways of, sending them, but a common way was to pack them in these slave ships, to cram as many bodies as they can. They knew that the fatality rates were high, right? In fact, out of the 12.5 million that are going to be sent across through the Middle Passage between the years of 1500 and, let's say, 1860, 1 out of 5 will not make it. Okay, you're going to have about 2 million perish. If you became ill on the way there, well, they threw you overboard, okay, because they didn't want the disease to spread. So, by accounts derived from, let's say, diaries of English slave traders describing this, it basically ended up being like this, where you cram these bodies. This is cargo of human beings, but now they're seen as commodities, not as people, right? They have a price tag on them, and um, it's the commodification of people. And you can only imagine the misery. Here, you can see they're chained by their legs and also by, in the upper area. So they can't move, they can't turn on their sides. And these diaries would talk about the slaves just going crazy. Imagine a 2 or 3 month voyage of this. Now, they knew that they had to feed them. Of course, they didn't starve, because they want to try to have as high as possible survival rate. So, there are accounts of them, trying to feed them sufficiently, trying to send some slaves on the deck of the slave ship to get some sunshine, maybe to stretch and to gain a little bit of exercise. But for the most part, this was misery at its worst. You could only imagine. Okay, so that's the slave. Excuse me. That's the Middle Passage. Um, and like I said, it took about by the end, it took about a month for it to be completed. Now, it deserves mention that most of them are going to the Caribbean. Excuse me. I did say that in the beginning of the topic. Okay. In fact, before slavery was established in Virginia, you had about 1 million slaves in the Caribbean already of African descent. Okay, so it's already established. The Middle Passage is already established. But what we're talking about is, in particular, American history. So that means we have to ask when or at what point does the English colonies decide to transition from it being a servant society or a society with slaves towards that of a slave society utilizing African labor. Okay, African slave labor to be more precise. So this is what we have to discuss next. And basically what we're doing is redefining here the society of colonial America in the South, whereby once slave societies emerge, it's going to change the complexion uh, of not only our economics, but of course our social relations, our political relations. Uh, Still today, we are feeling the effects of this transition towards slavery.